To increase the flexibility of your deployment and to cater to some of the most complex cases of globally distributed enterprises when it comes to network configuration, ExtremeCloud IQ implements something called Cloud Config Groups, or in short, CCGs. You can think about CCGs as tags or groups of access points. And what those tags mean, well, it could be specific to your deployment. Those tags could mean type of deployment, warehouse versus shop versus office. Or it could mean something completely different, like good location, bad location. So it's completely up to you how you define what those cloud config groups mean to you. And really, at the end of the day, they're just tags. But these tags can be used to group APs together, and those APs will be able to reuse the same configuration objects. For example, you would be able to assign captive web portals, SSIDs or radio profiles or device templates to devices within the same group. So typically, or natively in ExtremeCloud IQ, you are using assignment rules that are location-based to deploy configuration objects to those groups of APs. But you can go further, you can go beyond locations by using CCGs to further segment your network into more granular pieces and deploy or completely customize the way your network configuration is built and the way your devices are configured. So this really is a Swiss Army knife of one network policy and being able to configure not only by exception but by whatever rules you want. So this gives you the ultimate flexibility of building your configuration and still maintaining that single pane of glass, single network policy type of configuration throughout your whole deployment. Again, regardless of the number of devices and types of devices you're configuring. So if used correctly, CCGs or cloud config groups can be a very, very powerful mechanism, and our customers, especially customers using very large deployments, love them because it creates a very simple to use and an intuitive way of configuring very, very large deployments. Just like assignment rules and location-based rules, cloud config groups are used in conjunction with classification rules. So a classification rule basically creates a rule, it creates the instruction of how you want the configuration to be applied, and the criteria for selecting the rule is going to be, for example, in this case, matching the cloud config group's membership of the AP. And a classification rule can actually have multiple rules, and the way they're matched is top to bottom. And obviously the first match will take preference over the next ones, and only one match is implemented. So the lookup takes place from top to bottom, and the first rule that's matched is implemented. So that it's a good idea to keep that in mind where you're creating this list, because whatever matches first, if you start more generic first, then you may not be implementing what you want. So go from very specific rules to more generic, and whatever matches, that is going to get implemented. So let's tie all of this together. Once you create cloud config groups, you will then add access points or switches or routers to be members of that specific cloud config groups. And that basically assigns a tag to that group of devices. Then, when you're creating your network policy, you'll be creating classification rules that will use these tags to implement something like VLAN assignment or radius server assignment, different radius server for different locations, different radius server for different types of deployments, different time zones, different SSIDs, captive web portals, or different device templates with different radio profiles. So a lot of different rules can be built, and these rules are then visualized. When you go to your network policy, you will see those rules visualized top to bottom in your configuration. So on the screen, what you see is we have a cloud config group with multiple SSIDs, and the SSIDs are assigned based on which cloud config group does this access point belong to, and then that builds out the configuration for you. And this gives you the capability of creating very complex sets of configuration really quickly without having to ponder too much on how the different locations or different types of deployments are going to interplay with one another. The cloud config groups are a very powerful concept, but they can also be difficult to grasp at the beginning just because there's so many things you can do with them. So let's look at a couple of use cases of how you would use classification rules together with either location or cloud config groups. The first one would be, let's say you have a school with 2 floors, and you have switches deployed on floor 1, switches deployed on floor 2, and there's actually a router in between. So when you roam from one to another, or when you connect in one or the other floor, you're actually connecting to a different VLAN. And in floor number 1, or area number 1, as you see on the screen, you have user VLANs 8 and 16, whereas in floor number 2, we have VLANs 10 and 20. So different VLANs, but we're connecting the same types of users. So how you would create a configuration that would map these users to a different VLAN depending on where they're connecting? Well, you have two options. You can either use AP location, create a classification and assignment rule that will say if this access point is in area 1, well then create a user profile mapping rule for VLANs 8 and 16. If these access points are in area 2, or in location 2, then assign a user profile with either VLANs 10 or 20. And the same thing can be implemented using cloud config groups. You would put all the access points in area 1 in CCG area 1 and all the access points in area 2 in CCG area 2, and create a classification rule that would say, okay, based on the cloud config group membership, assign VLANs 10 or 20 or 8 and 16 depending on where the access points are. And you can immediately see, so you can either use location or cloud config groups, but if you in this case, if you use location and leave cloud config groups for something else, you could create something really powerful if needed, or you can use cloud config groups for something different later on. But again, you can use location or cloud config groups to solve the same problem just in a different way. The second example that we'll use is a cap-to-web portal assignment. So let's say we have 2 airports. We're deploying Wi-Fi in 2 different airports. One is in San Jose, the other one is San Francisco. And because these 2 airports need to have different cap-to-web portals, because they need to display different information, different marketing materials, different ways of signing up users, different user acceptance policies, for example, we need to be able to assign 2 different sets of cap-to-web portals. Now, we could decide to deploy 2 different network policies, one for San Jose, the other one for San Francisco. But the principle of ExtremeCloud IQ is we try to have a single network policy for a whole deployment. This makes it simpler, easier to control, and it's going to reduce the amount of configuration management on the administrator. We use cloud config groups, for example, or location. Again, same principle applies because San Francisco and San Jose are implicitly locations, to assign a different cap-to-web portal depending on where these access points are, depending on where the users are connecting. And using these rules, a user connecting in San Jose would see a different cap-to-web portal than a user in SFO, but you'd be able to reuse the same SSID, you'd be able to reuse the same network policy, everything would basically sum up to the same network policy object. So a couple of other examples of how you can use classification rules. Maybe not necessarily just based on location. You could use time zones. So time zone assignment is going to be important when you want to make sure that your devices have the correct clock, which is important for things like certificates, SSL communication, logging, syslog communication, and everything that would be dependent on a time setting. And there's a lot of things in networking that depend on having your clock synchronized correctly. So you could use classification use cases to apply a different time zone to devices in your West Coast by grouping all of your devices that are on the West Coast to a cloud config groups called West Coast, and all the devices in East Coast, you would group them in a cloud config group called East Coast, and then assign a different time zone for that group. You could also assign other types of devices, like a different NTP server based on the Cloud Config Group membership or based on location. You could assign a different radius server, a DNS server, DHCP server. So different server objects can also be assigned depending on the location or CCG or Cloud Config Group membership. So there's a lot of objects, pretty much all of the IP-based objects within ExtremeCloud IQ and all the VLAN objects can be assigned by Cloud Config Groups or by location with the use of classification rules. So again, location, Cloud Config Groups, and classification rules, together they create a very, very powerful tool, a very powerful mechanism to do either management by exception or to build really complex sets of configuration without having to navigate a lot of different objects and figuring out how to tie them together. It does implement it in a very straightforward way, and it also makes it easier to navigate this configuration when you want to take a look and change something.